September 15th, 1943. Montecorvino Airfield, Salerno, Italy. The pencil scratched frantically across the page as Oberst Dietrich Peltz, a Luftwaffe staff officer temporarily attached to Kesselring's headquarters, recorded observations that would fundamentally alter German understanding of American military capability. This cannot be accurate. The Americans landed here only 6 days ago, yet I count 17 aircraft operating from what was yesterday a wheat field. Through his field glasses, he had just witnessed something that contradicted everything German military doctrine taught about airfield construction. American C-47 transports were landing and taking off from a fully operational runway that had not existed 72 hours earlier. The steel matting gleamed in the Italian sun, laid down like a carpet across terrain that German engineers had dismissed as unsuitable for air operations without months of preparation. In Wehrmacht planning documents, proper airfield construction required a minimum of 6 weeks, assuming ideal conditions and no enemy interference. Yet here, under constant artillery fire and air attack, American engineers had created an operational fighter base in less time than it took German units to establish a field headquarters. 27 German staff officers, captured in the subsequent Allied advance through Italy, would later testify to their complete bewilderment at American engineering capabilities. What none of them knew was that this moment marked the beginning of a systematic dismantling of German assumptions about modern warfare, accomplished not through superior tactics or courage, but through an engineering revolution that rendered traditional military thinking obsolete. The mathematics of air superiority were being rewritten not in aerial combat statistics, but in construction timelines that German planners had deemed physically impossible. The revelation had begun 4 days earlier on September 9th, 1943, when Allied forces stormed ashore at Salerno. Among the first wave of landing craft were vehicles that German observers initially failed to identify. General Major Rudolf Sickenius, commanding the 16th Panzer Division's Reconnaissance Battalion, reported seeing American trucks carrying what appeared to be perforated steel sheets, thousands of them, stacked like oversized playing cards. His intelligence officers dismissed them as temporary road surfacing, perhaps for supply routes through the muddy Italian terrain. They had no conception that they were witnessing the deployment of pierced steel planking, or PSP, the innovation that would revolutionize warfare. The genesis of this transformation traced back to November 1941 at an obscure airfield near Marston, North Carolina. There, American engineers had accomplished what German planners considered impossible, constructing a 3,000-foot runway capable of handling heavy bombers in just 11 days. The secret lay in the deceptively simple design of interlocking steel mats, each one 10 feet long and 15 inches wide, weighing 66 pounds, perforated with 87 holes that reduced weight while maintaining strength. German military attachés in Washington had actually reported on these experiments, but their dispatches were dismissed in Berlin as American propaganda, another example of Yankee exaggeration designed to intimidate. Hauptmann Wilhelm Scholz, of the Wehrmacht's Engineering Corps, would later write in his post-war analysis, "We believed Americans were soft, that their society's obsession with comfort and convenience made them incapable of the harsh improvisations war demanded. We could not conceive that this very trait, their intolerance for discomfort, would drive them to engineer comfort into the battlefield itself." The first documented German encounter with American runway construction capabilities occurred at Henderson Field, Guadalcanal, though the Wehrmacht High Command wouldn't fully grasp its significance for another year. Japanese reports reaching Berlin through diplomatic channels in late 1942 described American engineers repairing bomb-cratered runways in hours rather than days. Oberkommando der Wehrmacht dismissed these accounts as Tokyo's attempt to excuse their failure in the Solomons. General Alfred Jodl reportedly told his staff that the Japanese were seeing phantoms to explain their defeats, but the phantoms were real. The 804th Engineer Aviation Battalion had landed with the Marines at Guadalcanal in August 1942, inheriting a partially completed Japanese airstrip. Within days, despite nightly bombardment from Japanese warships and daily air raids, they had transformed the facility into a base capable of supporting continuous combat operations. The Japanese, whose own engineering doctrine allocated weeks for such work, watched in disbelief as American bulldozers, working around the clock, accomplished in hours what their manual labor achieved in days. Lieutenant Colonel Friedrich von Kleist, captured at Salerno while commanding an artillery battery, would spend hours interrogating his American captors about their engineering capabilities, unable to accept their explanations. In letters to his wife discovered decades later in American archives, he wrote, "They speak of laying runways, as one might describe spreading a tablecloth. They have mechanized the impossible." The true shock for German commanders came with the scale of American production. Each steel mat required precise manufacturing to ensure perfect interlocking capability. The hooks and slots cut into each piece had to maintain tolerances of less than a 1/16 of an inch. German industry, despite its reputation for precision engineering, struggled to maintain such standards while producing a few thousand aircraft parts monthly. The Americans were producing 3 million square feet of PSP matting every month by mid-1943, enough to build 10 heavy bomber bases. At the Carnegie, Illinois Steel Company alone, 5 production lines ran continuously, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The steel arrived from mills in Pennsylvania, was pressed into shape by machines that exerted 2,000 tons of pressure, punched with holes in a pattern developed by the Army Corps of Engineers, and shipped to ports often before the paint had fully dried. Workers later recalled that the factory floor grew so hot from continuous operation that they had to rotate shifts every 2 hours to prevent heat exhaustion. The logistical chain that delivered these materials to combat zones defied German comprehension. General Feldmarschall Albert Kesselring, commanding German forces in Italy, would later calculate that moving the materials for a single American airfield required more shipping capacity than the entire Wehrmacht possessed in the Mediterranean. Yet the Americans built dozens of such fields, simultaneously, while maintaining their regular supply operations. Colonel Wilhelm Schmalz, whose Kampfgruppe had fought the Allied landings in Sicily, documented his observations of American engineering operations in a report that survived in Wehrmacht archives. On July 13, 1943, his reconnaissance units observed American engineers beginning work on an airfield near Gela. Day 1. Americans clear vegetation with armored bulldozers, impervious to sniper fire. Day 2. Ground leveled by machines working in darkness, using lights we would never dare illuminate. Day 3. Steel matting arrives on endless truck convoys. Day 4. First fighters land. This is not warfare as we understand it. This is industrial conquest. The aviation engineers themselves represented a revolution in military thinking that German doctrine had never contemplated. By 1943, over 118,000 American troops were dedicated solely to airfield construction, organized into specialized battalions, equipped with machinery that seemed fantastical to German observers. Each battalion possessed equipment worth more than an entire panzer company. D7 bulldozers that could move 20 tons of earth in minutes, graders that could level a field faster than 100 men with shovels, pneumatic drills that could break rock Wehrmacht pioneers would have had to blast. Sergeant Klaus Müller, a Wehrmacht pioneer captured in Sicily, watched American engineers work and later testified, "One American operator on a bulldozer accomplished more in an hour than my entire company could achieve in a week. But it wasn't just the machine, it was the systematic approach. They had a procedure for everything, timed to the minute. While we were still surveying, they were already landing aircraft." The 814th Engineer Aviation Battalion's operational history, captured intact when their headquarters was briefly overrun near Foggia, revealed the stunning pace of American operations. In 5 weeks in Sicily, they had constructed or repaired 13 airfields. They had removed 6,000 landmines without a single casualty, using magnetic detection equipment German pioneers didn't know existed. They had laid 2.5 million square feet of PSP matting, graded 3 million cubic yards of earth, and constructed drainage systems that turned swamps into all-weather runways. German intelligence initially refused to believe these reports. Oberst Hermann Balck, later to command a panzer division in France, and reviewed the captured documents and declared them obviously fabricated for deception purposes. He calculated that such work would require at least 10,000 laborers working for 6 months. When informed that the American battalion consisted of fewer than 800 men, he accused his intelligence officers of incompetence. The systematic nature of American airfield construction particularly unsettled German observers. The process had been standardized to an astonishing degree. site selection, surveying, clearing, grading, drainage installation, matting deployment, and facilities construction proceeded according to manuals that reduced complex engineering problems to simple checklists. A captured American Technical Manual, TM 5255, Aviation Engineers, became required reading for German staff officers, who struggled to comprehend its casual assumption that any piece of relatively flat ground could become an operational airfield within 72 hours. Lieutenant General Fridolin von Senger und Ettelin, commanding 70 Panzer Corps in Italy, observed American engineering operations from his headquarters overlooking the Rapido River Valley. He watched as the Americans built an entire complex of airfields in the valley below, despite German artillery positioned on the commanding heights. In his memoirs, he wrote, "We could destroy their work each night, cratering runways, demolishing facilities. Each morning, the damage was repaired before our pilots finished their breakfast. It was not a battle against an enemy, but against an industrial process that never stopped." The repair capabilities proved even more disturbing than the initial construction. German bombing raids, even when successful, achieved only temporary results. The Luftwaffe's technical officers calculated that a 500-kilogram bomb, creating a crater 30 feet wide and 15 feet deep, should close a runway for at least 48 hours, assuming around-the-clock repair efforts. American engineers typically had such damage operational again in 4 to 6 hours. The secret lay not just in equipment but in preparation. Aviation Engineer Battalions carried stockpiles of PSP specifically for repairs. They pre-positioned gravel, sand, and rapid-setting cement at strategic points around each airfield. They maintained bulldozers and graders on 24-hour standby. Most remarkably, they had standardized repair procedures to the point where crews could work in complete darkness, following memorized routines that allowed continuous operations despite German night attacks. Master Sergeant Antonio Benedetti, of the 825th Engineer Aviation Battalion, described the process in a letter home that was later published in Stars and Stripes. "Jerry drops his eggs at 2300 hours. By 23:15 we're rolling. Dozers push the debris aside, graders smooth the crater edges, trucks dump fill, compactors level it, and we're laying mat by midnight. By 0200, the PSP is locked down and painted. By dawn, our fighters are taking off over the spot where Jerry's bomb hit. It's like a choreographed dance. Everyone knows their moves." The German Air Force, already struggling with fuel shortages and pilot losses, found itself facing an impossible equation. Every airfield they attacked was operational again before they could mount a follow-up raid. Meanwhile, new American fields appeared faster than German intelligence could update their target maps. A Luftwaffe planning document from October 1943 listed 17 Allied airfields in the Foggia complex. By the time German pilots received their briefings, 24 were operational, with 7 more under construction. The specifications of American airfield construction seemed impossible to German engineers working with traditional methods. A standard fighter strip required 5,000 feet of runway, 150 feet wide, capable of handling aircraft weighing 30,000 pounds landing at 90 miles per hour. German doctrine, based on concrete construction, calculated 6 weeks minimum for such a project under ideal conditions. The Americans routinely completed them in under 72 hours, under combat conditions, often while under direct enemy observation and fire. General der Panzertruppe Joachim Lemelson, whose troops faced American air power in Italy, wrote in a report to OKW, "The enemy's air superiority is not primarily a question of aircraft numbers or pilot skill, though both are considerable. It is a question of omnipresence. Wherever we concentrate forces, an American airfield appears within days. We cannot interdict their construction because they build faster than we can attack." The composition of aviation engineer battalions fascinated German intelligence officers who interrogated captured Americans. These units included not just construction workers, but specialists drawn from across American society: civil engineers from state highway departments, equipment operators from mining companies, concrete specialists from dam projects, drainage experts from the Department of Agriculture. One battalion commander had previously managed construction of the Golden Gate Bridge. Another had built highways through the Rocky Mountains. This expertise was coupled with equipment that seemed miraculous to German observers accustomed to manual labor. The Caterpillar D7 bulldozer, the backbone of American airfield construction, could exert 20,000 pounds of drawbar pull, moving boulders that would have required German engineers to use explosives. The Northwest 80D crane could lift entire prefabricated buildings into position. The Quickway crane could unload a truck of PSP matting in 3 minutes, work that would have taken German pioneers an hour. Major Wilhelm Dürr, a Luftwaffe base commander captured in southern France, spent weeks studying American airfield operations as a prisoner. His post-war analysis, written for the United States Air Force Historical Studies, noted, "We operated from concrete runways built by the Todt organization over months or years, or from grass fields developed over generations. The Americans brought their runways with them, like a carpenter brings his tools. This was not an adaptation we could have made. It required an entire industrial philosophy we did not possess." The rapid construction capability fundamentally altered tactical possibilities in ways German commanders never fully adapted to counter. American commanders could establish forward fighter bases overnight, providing close air support at ranges previously impossible. They could shift the weight of air power along a front in days rather than weeks. Most devastatingly, they could afford to build airfields they might never use, creating uncertainty that forced German commanders to disperse their limited resources. During Operation Dragoon, the invasion of southern France in August 1944, American engineers outdid even their own previous achievements. The 852nd Engineer Aviation Battalion landed with the assault waves and had an emergency landing strip operational on D+1. By D+3, they had 2 fighter squadrons operating from French soil. By D+7, they had constructed 3 separate airfields, each capable of handling medium bombers. German commanders, who had expected at least 2 weeks before facing significant Allied air power, found themselves under continuous air attack from the second day of the invasion. Generaloberst Johannes Blaskowitz, commanding German Army Group G in southern France, reported to OKW, "The enemy's tactical air power multiplies daily. Each morning brings reconnaissance reports of new airstrips. Our movements, possible only at night, are restricted to a few kilometers before dawn, reveals us to enemy fighters operating from fields that did not exist when darkness fell." The cultural shock extended beyond mere technical capabilities. German military tradition emphasized permanence, solidity, and careful preparation. Luftwaffe bases featured concrete runways 2 feet thick, elaborate drainage systems, hardened hangars, and extensive support facilities. These installations, representing millions of man-hours and Reichsmarks, were strategic assets to be carefully defended. The American approach, temporary, flexible, almost disposable, represented a conceptual revolution German thinking could not accommodate. Colonel Hans Ulrich Rudel, the famous Stuka pilot, observed American operations while briefly stationed in Italy before the German withdrawal. He later wrote, "We spent 2 years building our base at Foggia. The Americans rebuilt it completely in 2 weeks after we destroyed it. But they didn't rebuild it as we would. Permanent, solid, traditional. They laid steel strips that could be pulled up and moved tomorrow. They erected tent hangars that could disappear in hours. They created capability without commitment. It was warfare without weight." The psychological impact on German troops proved as significant as the tactical advantages. Lancer, huddled in foxholes, watched American fighters operate from runways built where they had fought days earlier. Tank crews saw their carefully camouflaged positions revealed by reconnaissance aircraft operating from strips that hadn't existed when they had dug in. Artillery observers found their targets defended by fighters scrambled from fields built overnight. Gefreiter Johann Schmidt, whose letters home were preserved by his family, wrote in November 1943, "The Americans are not fighting a war, they are building a civilization. Wherever they advance, airports appear, roads are paved, telephone lines strung. We destroy, they build. We retreat from positions we've held for months. They build airfields in places we held yesterday. How can we defeat an enemy who carries his own geography with him?" The innovation extended beyond the basic PSP matting. American engineers developed specialized equipment for every conceivable challenge. The Rome plow, a massive blade designed for clearing vegetation, could remove trees 18 inches in diameter while moving at 5 miles per hour. Specialized drilling equipment could create drainage wells through solid rock. Portable rock crushers could convert rubble from bombed buildings into runway base material. Chemical soil stabilizers could turn sand into surfaces capable of supporting heavy bombers. The Wehrmacht's engineers, many of them skilled professionals before the war, found themselves reduced to manual labor while watching American teenagers operate machinery that transformed landscapes. A captured report from the 19th Luftwaffe Field Division noted with bewilderment that American boy soldiers, many appearing no older than 18, casually operated equipment worth more than entire German engineering companies possessed. The prefabrication revolution particularly stunned German observers. Entire airfield facilities arrived in numbered crates, ready for assembly like gigantic construction toys. Control towers, 40 feet tall, were erected in 8 hours. Hangars covering 15,000 square feet were operational in 2 days. Fuel systems, with underground tanks and miles of piping, were installed in 72 hours. Operations centers, complete with communications equipment, were functioning within 24 hours of arrival. Lieutenant Colonel Ernst Zimmermann, a Luftwaffe logistics officer, calculated that establishing equivalent facilities using German methods would require 2,000 tons of concrete, 500 tons of steel reinforcement, 50,000 man-hours of skilled labor, and a minimum of 8 weeks under perfect conditions. He watched Americans achieve superior results with 100 tons of prefabricated materials, 50 men, and 72 hours. The supply chain supporting this construction miracle defied German comprehension of logistics. Each aviation engineer battalion required 2,000 tons of equipment and supplies to establish a single fighter field. A bomber base required 5,000 tons, yet American Liberty ships, themselves products of revolutionary production methods, delivered these materials to invasion beaches where specialized landing craft designed specifically for PSP transportation brought them ashore. Within hours of hitting the beach, steel matting was moving inland on trucks built in Detroit, using fuel refined in Texas, following maps printed in Washington. General der Infanterie Gustav von Zangen, whose 15th Army faced American forces in Holland, described watching American C-47s land on a runway that his troops had defended 48 hours earlier. My operations officer insisted the grid reference was wrong. There was no airfield at that location. I had to show him through my field glasses. The Americans had built it while we were writing our reports about holding the position. The strategic implications gradually became clear to German commanders, though too late to develop effective countermeasures. The American ability to project air power anywhere, instantly, meant that traditional concepts of front lines became meaningless. Every German position, no matter how far from established Allied bases, was potentially under immediate air threat. Reserves couldn't concentrate without inviting attack from fighters operating from runways that hadn't existed when the movement orders were issued. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, commanding German forces in the West, issued a directive in May 1944 that revealed the Wehrmacht's growing desperation. Enemy airfield construction capabilities must be assumed to be unlimited. All planning must assume Allied tactical air support will be available within 72 hours of any landing or breakthrough. Traditional calculations of distance from enemy air bases are no longer valid. The directive was prophetic. After D-Day, American engineers performed even more spectacular feats. Advanced landing grounds sprouted across Normandy like mushrooms after rain. Alog 1, near Sainte-Mère-Église, was operational on D+3. By D+10, 9 American airfields were operational in Normandy. By D+30, there were 24. German units found themselves under constant attack from aircraft based so close that pilots could make 4 or 5 sorties daily, returning to rearm and refuel in minutes. Captain Hermann Buchner, a Wehrmacht intelligence officer who compiled reports on American engineering capabilities, wrote a post-war analysis that survived in American archives. We were not defeated by American courage, though they had courage. We were not defeated by American weapons, though their weapons were excellent. We were defeated by American engineers who made geography irrelevant. They built their victory, runway by runway, across Europe. The pinnacle of American airfield construction efficiency came during the Rhine crossing operations in March 1945. The 834th Engineer Aviation Battalion crossed the Rhine at Remagen and had an emergency strip operational on the eastern bank within 18 hours. By the end of the second day, they were landing C-47s carrying supplies directly to the bridgehead. German commanders, who had planned their defense assuming several days before Allied air power could effectively support the crossing, found their positions untenable within hours. Major General Fritz Bayerlein, commanding the Panzer Lehr Division, reported to his superiors, "The Americans bring their air force with them like artillery. Where they arrive in the morning, their aircraft operate by evening. We cannot move, cannot concentrate, cannot effectively resist. They have industrialized warfare beyond our comprehension." The numbers told a story that no amount of German courage or tactical skill could overcome. By war's end, American aviation engineer battalions had constructed or reconstructed over 1,000 airfields across Europe and the Pacific. They had laid over 300 million square feet of PSP matting, enough to build a runway from Berlin to Moscow. They had moved 500 million cubic yards of earth, graded 50 million square yards of surface, and installed 1,000 miles of drainage pipe. They had accomplished in months what German military engineers calculated would require decades. Werner Kreipp, Chief of Staff of the Luftwaffe, made a final assessment in American captivity that captured the totality of German miscalculation. "We planned for a war of armies and battles, of courage and sacrifice. The Americans fought a war of production and engineering, of efficiency and logistics. We believed war was an art. They proved it was an industry. Every crashed American plane was replaced tomorrow. Every cratered runway was operational by dawn. We could destroy, but they could create, and creation proved more powerful than destruction." Wehrmacht veterans, interviewed decades after the war, consistently cited American engineering capabilities as the most psychologically devastating aspect of fighting the Western Allies. Unlike combat, which German military tradition had prepared them for, the industrial transformation of warfare left them conceptually defenseless. They could understand being outfought. They couldn't comprehend being outbuilt. Feldwebel Karl-Heinz, a veteran of both Eastern and Western fronts, explained the difference in a 1975 interview. "Against the Russians, we fought battles. Against the Americans, we fought factories. When we destroyed a Russian position, it stayed destroyed until they could bring up reserves. When we destroyed an American position, it was rebuilt before we could reload our guns. The Russians had courage and numbers. The Americans had bulldozers and steel matting. I feared the bulldozers more." The portable airfield technology reached its apotheosis in Operation Varsity, the airborne crossing of the Rhine in March 1945. American engineers jumped with the paratroopers, carrying lightweight aluminum planking designed specifically for rapid runway construction in airborne operations. Within 6 hours of landing, they had established landing zones for gliders carrying additional equipment. Within 12 hours, they had an operational airstrip capable of evacuating wounded and bringing in supplies. German commanders, observing this, realized that American forces had achieved the ultimate military flexibility. They could establish air superiority anywhere, instantly, regardless of terrain or opposition. General der Fallschirmjäger Hermann Bernhard Ramke, Germany's most experienced paratrooper commander, watched American airborne engineers work and later admitted, "We invented airborne warfare, but the Americans perfected it. We could seize objectives, they could build bases, we could capture airfields, they could create them. They had industrialized even the most elite form of warfare." The contrast with German methods became increasingly stark as the war progressed. The Luftwaffe's own construction units, the Luftwaffe Bautruppen, operated with methods essentially unchanged since World War I. They relied heavily on manual labor, often using forced workers and prisoners of war. A typical German airfield construction project in 1944 might employ 5,000 workers for 3 months to achieve what an American aviation engineer battalion could accomplish with 800 men in 3 days. General Major Walter Grabman, commander of 3rd Fighter Division, described inspecting a captured American airfield in France. Everything was temporary yet completely functional. The control tower was prefabricated wood that could be dismantled in hours, yet it had better equipment than our permanent installations. The hangars were canvas and steel tubes, looking like circus tents, yet they protected aircraft better than our concrete structures because they could be quickly repaired or replaced. It was the architecture of victory, substance without permanence, capability without commitment. The cultural implications extended beyond military considerations. German military tradition valued permanence, monuments to engineering skill that would last generations. The Luftwaffe's pre-war airfields were architectural statements, with Art Deco terminals and monumentalist hangars. American airfields were purely functional, designed to last exactly as long as needed, and not one day more. This philosophical difference reflected deeper disparities in how the two nations approached warfare itself. Professor Heinrich Fock, designer of the Focke-Wulf aircraft, visited American-constructed airfields after his capture and wrote, "German engineering seeks perfection, the ideal solution that will stand forever. American engineering seeks adequacy, the quickest solution that will work today. In peace, our approach might be superior. In war, theirs proved devastating. While we were still calculating stress loads, they were landing aircraft. The speed of American construction created tactical opportunities that German doctrine had never anticipated and could never counter. During the breakout from Normandy, American commanders could order air support from fields that would be built after the orders were issued but before the attack commenced. The Third Army's race across France was supported by airfields that advanced almost as fast as the ground troops, maintaining continuous close air support at ranges that should have been impossible. Colonel Hermann Zimmermann, operations officer for Luftflotte 3, reported in August 1944, "American fighter bombers operate at will, seemingly unlimited by range considerations. Our intelligence estimates of their capabilities, based on known airfield locations, are worthless. They build new fields faster than we can update our maps. We are fighting an enemy who reshapes geography to suit his tactical needs." The repair capabilities proved as decisive as initial construction. During the Battle of the Bulge, German commanders counted on winter weather to ground Allied aircraft and allow their offensive to proceed unmolested. They hadn't calculated that American engineers could clear snow from PSP runways in minutes using specialized equipment, while German fields with concrete runways remained unusable for days. The ability to maintain operations in weather that grounded the Luftwaffe provided a decisive advantage. The psychological impact on German pilots was profound. Unlike attacking permanent installations where damage accumulated over time, attacks on American fields seemed pointless. Young Luftwaffe pilots, already facing overwhelming numerical odds, lost motivation for missions that achieved nothing lasting. Veterans reported that squadron morale collapsed when intelligence showed targeted airfields operational within hours of successful attacks. Lieutenant Wolfgang Fischer, a Messerschmitt 262 jet pilot, one of Germany's last hopes for air superiority, described his experience. "Our jets gave us a speed advantage that should have been decisive. But speed meant nothing when the enemy had airfields everywhere. We could outrun their fighters, but not their geography. Every emergency landing field we might use was destroyed or captured. Every field they needed appeared overnight." The production statistics behind American airfield construction defied German comprehension of industrial capability. The United States produced enough PSP matting to cover 200 square miles, using steel that Germany desperately needed for tanks and submarines. The manufacturing process required precise engineering and quality control that German factories, under constant bombing and resource constraints, could never have maintained. Yet Americans produced it alongside record quantities of aircraft, ships, vehicles, and every other implement of war. Albert Speer, Hitler's armaments minister, studied captured American production figures and concluded they were propaganda. When post-war analysis confirmed their accuracy, he admitted, "We could not conceive of such industrial capacity because it exceeded not just our means but our imagination. The Americans were not just fighting a different war, they were fighting in a different century." The legacy of American airfield engineering haunted German military professionals long after the war. In NATO planning sessions during the 1950s, former Wehrmacht officers would interrupt discussions of Soviet capabilities to ask about airfield construction capacity, traumatized by their experience of American engineering overwhelming traditional military calculations. General Franz Halder, former chief of the German General Staff, wrote in his memoirs, "We prepared for every contingency except one, that the enemy would simply build his way to victory. The Americans treated Europe like a construction site, and they had the tools to reshape it according to their needs. Our finest tactical minds were defeated by American bulldozers and prefabricated materials." The transformation of warfare that American aviation engineers represented went beyond mere technical capability. They embodied an approach to military problems that treated traditional constraints as engineering challenges to be solved rather than limitations to be accepted. Mountains, rivers, swamps, and distances that had shaped European warfare for millennia became minor inconveniences to be bulldozed, bridged, drained, or simply ignored. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, reflecting on the Italian campaign, made perhaps the most eloquent summary of German bewilderment. "We were the inheritors of Clausewitz and Moltke, masters of operational art, students of 2,000 years of European warfare. We knew how to fight in every terrain, under every condition, against every enemy. But the Americans did not fight terrain, they transformed it. They did not accept conditions, they created new ones. They did not defeat us in battle. They built their victory, piece by piece, runway by runway, until our expertise became irrelevant and our experience worthless." The final humiliation came during the occupation, when German officers were required to attend American engineering demonstrations. They watched aviation engineer battalions construct complete airfields in exercises, accomplishing in hours what German doctrine stated required weeks. Veterans reported leaving these demonstrations in tears, finally understanding the totality of their miscalculation. Colonel Joachim Muncheberg, a fighter pilot with 135 victories, attended one such demonstration in 1946. He wrote to his wife, "Today I watched American engineers build in 4 hours what we could not build in 4 weeks. I finally understand why we lost. We brought warriors to an industrial competition. We thought courage and skill would triumph over material superiority. We did not comprehend that they would make material superiority so overwhelming that our courage became irrelevant." The numbers provided the epilogue to German military pride. American aviation engineers constructed 235 major airfields in Europe alone, not counting hundreds of emergency strips and temporary facilities. They laid enough PSP matting to build a highway from London to Istanbul. They moved enough earth to fill a canal from the Baltic to the Black Sea. They achieved construction rates that German engineers, even using slave labor, never approached. In the Pacific, the statistics were even more staggering. Engineers transformed coral atolls into major air bases, built runways through jungle that German observers had deemed impassable, created facilities on islands that German strategists had dismissed as unusable. The apex came at Tinian, where American engineers built the world's largest airfield in 1944, 6 runways each over 8,000 feet long, from which B-29s would launch the atomic attacks that ended the war. Vice Admiral Friedrich Ruge, Germany's senior naval engineer, studied American construction methods during his post-war internment. His conclusion was stark. "We measured military power in divisions, ships, and aircraft. The Americans measured it in tons of concrete poured, miles of runway laid, cubic yards of earth moved. We were correct that modern war would be won by industrial power. We simply never imagined that industrial power could be projected directly onto the battlefield, that factories could be weapons as surely as cannons." The revolution in military engineering that American aviation engineers represented fundamentally changed warfare. The ability to create air superiority anywhere, instantly, through engineering rather than combat, rendered traditional military geography obsolete. Distance from bases, terrain obstacles, and seasonal conditions, factors that had governed military operations throughout history, became minor variables in American planning. General Heinz Guderian, architect of German armored warfare, made a final assessment that captured the existential shock to German military thinking. "We perfected mobile warfare, the blitzkrieg that conquered Europe. But the Americans achieved something greater, mobile infrastructure. They didn't just move armies quickly, they moved civilization itself. They brought their entire industrial base to the battlefield, assembled it under fire, and operated it in combat. We were still fighting the last war while they were inventing the next one. The story of German encounters with American airfield construction is ultimately a narrative of conceptual defeat. The Wehrmacht, inheritor of centuries of European military tradition, found itself facing an opponent who had transcended that tradition entirely. American aviation engineers didn't defeat German military art, they made it irrelevant. They proved that in modern warfare, the ability to build was more powerful than the ability to destroy, that creation could overwhelm destruction, that engineering could triumph over tactics. SS Obergruppenführer Paul Hauser, one of Germany's most decorated commanders, provided perhaps the most poignant epitaph for German military presumptions in a conversation with American interrogators. "You Americans kept saying you would win because you could outproduce us." We laughed, thinking you meant more tanks and planes. "We didn't understand you meant you would produce the battlefield itself, that you would manufacture the very ground we fought on. You didn't defeat the Wehrmacht, you bypassed it, building your victory on runways that didn't exist when the battle started." The German generals who had studied Napoleon's campaigns, who could quote Clausewitz and debate Schlieffen, who understood every principle of European warfare, found themselves undone by American teenagers operating bulldozers and laying steel planks. They had prepared for every form of warfare except the one they faced: industrial construction at battlefield pace, engineering as a weapon system, building as a form of combat. In the end, German military professionals were left with a truth too bitter to fully accept. They had not been outfought but outbuilt. The finest army in Europe, perhaps in history, had been defeated not by superior strategy or tactics, but by an enemy who could transform wheat fields into air bases overnight, who could repair in hours what took days to destroy, who fought not with courage alone but with steel matting and bulldozers. General Feldmarschall Wilhelm Keitel, signing Germany's surrender, reportedly told General Eisenhower, "We knew we would face American industry. We did not know we would face it directly, on the battlefield, in the form of engineers who could build faster than we could destroy." Eisenhower's reply, if accurately recorded, was telling, "That's why you lost." The legacy endures in military doctrine worldwide. Modern warfare assumes rapid airfield construction, forward base development, and expeditionary engineering as fundamental capabilities. The revolution that shocked German generals in 1943 has become so routine that modern military officers cannot imagine warfare without it. Yet for the Wehrmacht officers who first witnessed American engineers unrolling runways from trucks, it was the moment their world ended and a new age of warfare began. They had expected to fight Americans. They had not expected Americans to abolish the battlefield itself, replacing it with an industrial landscape that appeared and disappeared according to tactical needs. They had not imagined that their enemy's greatest weapon would not be a tank or plane or gun, but the ability to transform any piece of ground into an airbase, instantly, repeatedly, unstoppably. The German generals never imagined American engineers would unroll airstrips from trucks overnight. They were wrong. That miscalculation, more than any battle or campaign, explains why the Wehrmacht, master of continental warfare, found itself helpless before an enemy who had industrialized victory itself. In the end, the Germans brought a military to an engineering competition, and they lost before they understood the nature of the contest.